Hi everyone, thank you for coming to this seminar, Thinking Space. So now we have Dr. Jarrah Sastrawan. He's a historian specialized in Indonesian history. He is now a postdoctoral at Ecole Paris. He received his PhD at the uni and now doing some research in Indonesia. So today he's going to present his research about Indonesian history. So welcome, Natalie. So good to have you here. Yeah, without further ado, I'd like Jarrah to present. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Uni. Thanks everyone for being here and for inviting me. I'm really happy to be sharing some of my work, and I'd be very keen to hear the feedback of you all from different disciplinary contexts, but nevertheless, the sort of work that I do, I think, is always, whether explicitly or more implicitly, engaging with problems of geography, of space, and time, certainly. But I thought it would be useful for me, particularly, to think about how both time and space are constructed in the sorts of materials I work with. So just for a bit of background, as you mentioned, I'm a historian. I did my PhD here at Sydney in the Asian Studies program, focusing on traditional historiography, so traditional chronicles, inscriptions from Indonesia, going back up to 1,000 years, which tell of the histories, the pasts of the traditional societies of that region. And in doing so, I sort of continued that work in my postdoc at the EFEO, focusing on old documents that talk primarily about how the past and how land is sort of constructed, is understood in textual form. So mostly almost entirely I work with texts, but inevitably I also engage with the material and artifactual aspects of those texts, whether they're palm leaf manuscripts or inscriptions on stone or on copper. The material aspects and the physical nature of these texts are also really important, particularly when we're thinking about how they relate to time and space. So the topic I want to focus on today is about how fields are constructed in historical texts. So if we have a narrative about the past, whether it's a history of the French Revolution, whether it's a chronicle from Java or from Sulawesi, whether it's legendary stories from the Middle Ages, all of these types of narrative exist in some sort of time and space. And the setting needs to be constructed so that the field of events needs to be generated through specific narrative techniques. It's a sort of, I guess my approach, sort of narratological, or sort of focused on how structures are created through the use of specific textual devices. Historical texts particularly are concerned with events that happen in time, often also sort of in a broader spatial environment, but certainly the duration of time is a particularly important aspect of what makes a text historical. And it's vital when we think about history, how the events that are described are positioned within broader frames of reference. So how, for example, does a story about Alexander the Great, a real historical figure, get framed? One way of framing it is by using, say, Greek and Roman sources to understand it as part of the expansion of Macedon and the conquest of the Persian Empire. But in another frame, for example, in many later medieval Muslim, Persian, and Malay histories, the story of Alexander the Great is reframed in terms of the history of Islam, even though there's 900 years separating these two phases. Alexander the Great, under the guise of Iskandar Zulkarnain, becomes a Quranic figure, becomes part of the expansion of Islam into India. So the boundaries or the development of historical narratives and their relationship to legend and their relationship to other kinds of stories One big part of that is about how time and space are framed, how the events of historical significance are placed within those fields. So I wanted to focus on how these fields are constructed through specific kinds of narrative device. I say narrative, but in fact, they're devices which are more broadly applied, things like the calendar system that we use, genealogies, the ways in which we connect different members of a kinship group, itineraries, ways in which we talk about how people move through land, through geographies, the use of toponyms and schemas. So all of these I view as devices or techniques that are applied in text. So they have an existence outside, of course, of textual life, but I'm particularly interested in how these elements are deployed inside historical text in order to construct a notion of time and space. As I noted before, I mostly work with written sources, so manuscripts in, say, Javanese, Malay, the vernacular languages of Indonesia, but these written texts form only a part of the broader textual milieu of that culture, of those cultures, and these objects, these texts that are transmitted also exist in oral forms, and they also pertain to and connect with non-textual, non-verbal artifacts. And so it's important always, even if we take a focus on written media, to understand their connections with other forms, other modes of communication. And I guess the sort of where it's all going in terms of thinking about these fields is to note and to understand more specifically and concretely how some of the things that we take for granted in our histories and our historiographies might have alternative ways of being done. So we are very used to the timeline, for example, a single line from the past to the present, regularly divided up using, our common era or other kinds of calendars in order to place events, on a single coherent timescale. Also, the use of, maps that accurately reflect the physical landscape, certainly with selection, with the emphasis on certain kinds of feature, but nevertheless, we generally aim in modern historiography to connect and to link historical events, historical information to as realistic a setting as possible. And we dislike it when stories seem to be detached from a coherent timeline, where they seem to be vague with respect to their location, or it's difficult or impossible to link it back to what we consider to be a realistic space and time. However, when we look at these pre-modern texts or early modern texts, we find actually that there's not only one way of doing these things. And the interest comes from then looking at the alternatives in terms of how can time and space be organized differently for the purposes of writing history. So let me focus on time first. This is my sort of original starting point. When I was doing my master's and also partly during my PhD, I focused a lot on how time was constructed in these texts. And when we think about time as a construct of specific kinds of narrative devices, we can reduce most of the effect, or the consequence of using these devices, such as calendars, is to structure time in terms of two basic elements: moments, which are basically conventionalized as points, a specific moment of time, and intervals, which is a way of describing the distance or the difference between two specified moments. And when we think about this, I imagine we immediately think of a single timeline from the past to the present with dots on it and quantifiable spaces between those dots. This is when the Bastille fell, and then this is when Napoleon became emperor. This is when he was defeated at Waterloo. But in fact, we find that there are all kinds of different ways in which these moments intervals can be structured. The purpose of the devices that I talked about, such as the calendar, genealogies, era, and I'll go through each of these one by one, is to label, order, and anchor those moments. So first, to label. Days of the week is a good example of a device, calendar that labels specific intervals of time. Today is Wednesday. Order is another important thing. We know that because today is Wednesday, tomorrow is Thursday, and yesterday was Tuesday. So the device intrinsically contains a labeling system and ordering system. But interestingly, the days of the week don't contain an anchoring system. That is, there is no, if you say it's Wednesday, it doesn't specify which Wednesday we're talking about. There is no unique anchor point for the intervals that have been defined through the calendar, and that differs from the era. So if we say it's 2023, that is a unique moment. That's a unique interval in time. It won't be repeated because the era, the device that we're using, which is the common era, is anchored to a specific point that is unique in time. The epoch of our era is unreproducible. So there is a distinction, even though we use calendars and eras together. So we say it is the 12th, I think it's the 12th of October, isn't it? Or is it the 13th? It's the 11th of October. Okay, so I've got the label wrong. It's the 11th of October, and it's 2023. So those two separate devices are being used in order to specify precisely the day within the broader scope of history. And that calendar and era produces a unilinear timescale, but that's not the only way of doing things. We know, of course, that there are different kinds of calendars. This is one example of Balinese calendar that's laid out as a grid of 210 days, each of which has some sort of significance based on whether there's a cross or a dot or an X, or a circle, sorry, in them, and these are used for various kinds of divination purposes. This sort of thing is pretty common throughout the world, different systems for determining which days are good and bad for certain activities. But as you can see, the construct is visualized in a table format. The most familiar kind of time that we use, particularly in historical texts, is a combination of calendar and era time. So as I mentioned, the calendar provides a cyclical element. So it provides the name of the month, the name of the weekday, the number of the weekday. And in Indonesia, there are a number of different types of calendars they used. Julian calendar, which is one of the Gregorian calendar, which is one that we use. The Islamic calendar, which many will be familiar with as well, because it remains part of the Islamic religion. The Indic calendar, which is traditionally widespread in Southeast Asia, but really now only limited to some areas, such as Bali, for example, whereas still very much part of Indian life. And then in conjunction with these calendars, we have these eras that provide an anchor, whether it's the Common Era, the Shaka era, which is also historically very important in Indonesia, the Hijra era, which is also connected to Islamic timekeeping. So we have here in the image an example of a Bugis chronicle, so chronicle from South Sulawesi, in which you can see there's at least, well, there's two scripts being used. Bugis script, which is sort of the contents, and then Arabic script as the frame. So you can see here on the top right, there's the year 1789. Interestingly, despite it being a highly Islamic environment, and the use of Arabic clearly shows that, the era being used is the Christian era, AD. And this is an interesting aspect of the historiography of the Bugis, how their historiography has absorbed both Arabic elements, it's absorbed timekeeping from probably the Portuguese in terms of using the Christian calendar, but then retaining the use of their own traditional script and language for the content. So we can see here, we have the year 1789, kind of nominee of our era, and then a list along the left-hand column of days of the month. And so those are in Arabic numerals. And each of the lines indicates some event. So that the chronicle, these were originally called diaries because they looked like diaries, they looked like sort of journals that you might have in a business context. But increasingly, research is showing that they're more like chronicles. So they're more like traditional histories that are passed down, where events are briefly summarized in terms of the dates and years in which they occur, and that information is compiled into new sorts of books. So here we've got the use of calendar and era devices that create very literally a frame, right? So we can see how the timeline, the single unilinear timeline, is produced simply by showing how the days are laid out down the vertical column on the left-hand side. So it's a clear example of how then historical information is broken up into these segments that are ordered linearly. So essentially, if we wanted to construct a modern historical narrative using this source, as long as we understood the script or language, it would be very easy, because we would simply transpose this information onto a timeline that we ourselves had. We might compare it to Dutch records, records of the VOC, which also are dated in the same way and using the same calendar. And then we would be able to compare, well, do they agree, do they disagree, do they show different perspectives on the same event? So these sorts of sources were beloved by historians, Western historians in particular, because they were so easy to use, because they're so close already to the time structures that we as modern historians take for granted. But there are different ways of representing that sort of date information, calendar information. One way that's particularly prominent in Java and Bali is what's called a chronogram. And the chronogram is a cross-cultural phenomenon. It's a symbolic representation of the digits in a year. And it's not just found in Southeast Asia or in India, it's also found throughout Europe. There are different systems for doing it. The system that's used in Indonesia, certainly in pre-Islamic Indonesia, resembles that of the Indian system, which is that the digits, each digit of the year is encoded as a word or a symbol. And sometimes that symbol is just as a sentence, but other times, like in this example, it's visually depicted. So here, what's being depicted on the wall of a temple in East Java is an image of the dragon king biting the sun. So you can see there's a dragon, he's got a crown, there's a sun in his mouth, he's biting it. And conventionally, each of these symbols, each of these terms is associated with a particular number, and that association is traditional. It comes from very old Indian texts. There are some that make clear sense. The sun was one sun in the sky, so it means one. Usually there's only one king, and so the king means one. But some are less straightforward. The dragon is 8. The word for bite is 3. Some of these can be traced back to Indian models. Some of them are innovations in the Javanese context. But the way it works is that the image of the sentence that it encodes represents the numbers 8, 1, 3, 1. Generally, these codes to be read backwards. So you start with the thousands at the end, 1,318 of the Shaka era, which was the standard era that was used during the Hindu-Buddhist period in Java, which is equivalent to our 1396. So it's a late 14th century image, and in this case, most likely refers to the foundation of that temple. This is a way in which the Javanese liked to encode creatively the dates that they drew on temples, that they included in their histories as well. So the purpose of a chronogram is not just sort of ornamentation or to make something more interesting. It's also to convey a sense of the significance of a moment. So if we simply take a string of years, sort of the common era just going from 1 to 2023, each year is very much like the rest. There are some which by virtue of the decimal system seem more significant. So like centennial years, millennial years, we all remember the celebrations in the year 2000. That's in fact arbitrary, right? There's nothing particular that happened at that time except the threat of Y2K. But that itself was simply an effect of the use of the decimal system. And there's no intrinsic significance to that year. The era system, the era device doesn't impart any specific structures in the way that, for example, a good alternative example is the weekday. because in Abrahamic traditions, there's the concept of a Sabbath. So for people who belong to Christian faith or Jewish or Islamic religions, there is a day, whether it's Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, which is considered special, which is part of the religion, a time of rest, a time that is held sacred. So there, the week itself contains a sort of a special time. So one of the days is set out as being unique. What the chronograms do is that it adds all this extra layers of meaning to what would otherwise just be numbers. So the idea behind it is that the Javanese were keen to draw significance out of the fact that certain events happened at certain times. And very often we see that in historiography, for example, a catastrophe will happen in a particular year, and that year will be encoded using words that talk about death, that talk about destruction, that talk about loss. And the reason for that being that they're trying to connect significance of the events with the significance of the time interval in which they occur. This is a strong feature of Indonesian, I would say, but not exclusively, ways of thinking about time, that if something significant occurs, it must be because that significance is carried through the time itself. There's a sense in which what Walter Benjamin called sort of the empty homogeneous time of Western modern life is not really present in these traditional cultures, that time always bears with it some sort of significance and full of meaning. And chronograms is one way of both, I would say, constructing that meaning. One could also just say reflecting that meaning if one believes that it's part of the tradition that already reflects some intrinsic truth about how time works. Another really important device that's used in historiography, certainly in the Islamic period, but even before in Indonesia, is genealogies. So it makes a lot of sense that if you're writing a history, particularly if you're writing a history of a kingdom, of a dynasty, of a state, that the relationships, kinship amongst leaders is a really crucial aspect of that. But in many genres of Indonesian history writing, such as the Babat in Java, the Silsilah texts in Malaysia, or in the Malay world, genealogy becomes so important that it becomes the defining structural feature of the text. So the use of the genealogy is not simply content, but the way in which time passes in the text and the events that occur in the text are ordered with reference to the fact that they occur within the lifetime of individuals. And then these individuals are connected through complicated relationships like the one shown in this genealogy. There are often in these texts little or no other forms of temporal device. So in the genealogical texts, it's very rare for us to also see calendars being used, or years being used, or other kinds of ways for us to tell when an event occurred. And so the only way to understand the passage of events is by trying to figure out who are the people involved in them and when did they live. And the only way to figure out when they lived is to know what the genealogy is. This tradition in Indonesia seems to be sort of influenced from both directions, both from Indian models, certain kinds of Indian mythological texts that emphasize lineage very strongly, but certainly in terms of Islamic, particularly Islamic scripture, and the common heritage of the Abrahamic religions that have the lineages of the prophets as their fundamental temporal principle. So the use of these genealogies to organize time are important because it allows the reader and the listener to understand what period, what era events are occurring and why one has an effect on the other. But unlike the timeline, unlike the era, which generates a single line, the fact that genealogies have a branch-like structure, that they're dendritic, they like trees, means that you end up with all of these parallel lines that are not in sync with each other and they don't form a unity. Rather, you have these alternative branches of the family, alternative moments, and it's not always possible to then reduce that back to a single timeline. That's why the genealogical texts are much more challenging for us modern historians to work with, because they don't provide us with a single unitary timeline on which we can place events. Rather, we have to try and piece it together, depending on when an event occurs. Say, who does it occur to in this genealogy? Who are the factors involved, and when did they live? Well, without knowledge of this whole genealogy, we wouldn't necessarily be able to understand and locate where those events were occurring. So the use of genealogies produces a more complex sort of time structure that we have to find alternative ways of working with, because sometimes it's not possible for us to neatly and easily connect, as would have been the case with the previous example of the chronology, the table-like chronicle that I showed before, easily able to integrate it with Western sources and Western archives. Another really important time structure is what I call lepsis, which is in textual studies called lepsis. It's a way of either flashing forward or flashing back, basically. It's like a way of embedding bits of episode into other contexts in the text. Again, emphasize that this is about how time is constructed in text. So these are narrative structures. And this occurs very often in Indonesian historiography. And the reason is in order to make further arguments. So if the chronograms, if the visualization or the symbolization of time in the previous slide was about imparting a sense of significance and meaning to time, so too does lepsis allow us to fill time with some sort of meaning and connection with other things. And in, again, going to a religious context, this is very much the purpose of what's in biblical studies is called figuration. So looking for the ways in which the New Testament has been predicted by the Old Testament, where Old Testament prophecies are realized, brought to life in the New Testament. This is very much a feature of connecting two different periods of time, two different contexts through reference, through making one meaningful with reference to the other. As in it short circuits the temporal distance. So the distance is established through other means, whether it's because it's been 20 generations apart, whether it's 1,000 years difference. The other device establish the distance between two events, two contexts, and then the use of lepsis, whether it's a prophecy, whether it's a memory of something that happened in the past, short circuits that. And it says, well, actually, these two things in a way are coeval because one anticipates the other, one is the culmination of the other. These sorts of texts, these sorts of predictions, of course, are popular cross-culturally as well. They're certainly not exclusive to Indonesia. But here's an example that's particularly popular in Java, the prophecies of Jayapaya. So the idea here as well is that even apart from the branch-like, tree-like structure of genealogical time, we have these leaps of times. We have a way in which events in the past don't simply endure in a linear fashion, but they sort of remanifest in the present. Or similarly, that events in the future are not waiting there in the distance to be experienced, but they are manifest through the power of prophecy. And they're justified by the fact that the prophecy has been made about it. And so that event must be fated, it must be often just. It is the good and true thing to happen because it's already been preempted or anticipated through the use of this temporal device. So there's a number of ways in which the texts organize events in time in ways that perhaps are not so familiar to us as readers of modern historiography. So moving to the construction of space, and I will connect them at the end, but it's interesting. I mean, what I find notable is actually how limited the kinds of constructions of space are in Indonesian historical texts. There are really only two types of devices, opposed to the multiple ones that I showed for time, in which space is organized, is laid out and the field is structured. One is the itinerary, or the labeling, the naming of places along a one-dimensional route, often dramatized or manifested as a person walking through a countryside, walking through a region or a territory, passing by named places along the way. And the second type is the mandala scheme, a sort of a theoretical, geometrical conception of space, generally center focused, so symmetrical about a center. The word mandala itself refers to a circle in Sanskrit, but it is in both Indian texts, but also in Indonesian interpretations of those texts, referring more broadly to the idea of an ambit or a scope of territory. These are highly theoretical, and when they are applied to real geographies, when they're applied to real territories and places, they have this schematizing or idealizing effect. It's quite rare for us to see a sort of empirically rich, that's not the right word, sort of empirically justified elucidation of a mandala. Often it emphasizes the theoretical ideas of balance and symmetry more than it does the actual landscape as we observe it. I just wanted to make a note that we have almost no pre-colonial maps at all, which is a big shame. They almost certainly did exist in some form or other. We have a few Portuguese mentions from the early 16th century that there existed maps made by the Javanese. These may have been sailing maps and navigational charts rather than maps of land, but we don't know because they were lost. I have some colleagues in the Netherlands who discovered a few early 19th century maps, I think, that was sort of culturally hybrid between Dutch and Javanese style of map making, but unfortunately the evidence is very limited to go on. So what we have is the texts, and if we try to understand how space was conceptualized, the use of maps, though quite likely in effect in early Indonesia, early Java, really we can't say much more about it, unfortunately. So the first device of organizing space is the itinerary, as I mentioned. And this sort of trope or structure appears in many different kinds of textual genres in Indonesia. This is a very famous text from Java called the Centini story. And it is structured as a series of grand adventures or journeys throughout the Javanese landscape. But it's actually, if we look at the content of that text, very much more a sort of encyclopedia. So the idea is that the itinerary is a series of point-like locations that the protagonists move through and visit. But each time they visit the point or a place, or a village or a settlement, then a whole bunch of information is expounded in that place by the person who lives there, the wise man or woman who exists in that place, or they have some experience that lead to more knowledge. So what's relevant for us is the manner in which the knowledge, which could be of an incredibly diverse nature and very general, not necessarily just geographical knowledge, historical knowledge, religious knowledge, is placed in this itinerary structure. It's not as though it's alphabetized or thematized as we would expect a encyclopedia to be in our experience, but rather that the itinerary is the structure of the encyclopedia. And this tendency to use space to organize knowledge is one which is particularly prevalent in the Javanese context, especially the use then of the itinerary to order that knowledge in terms of a series of linked locations. So these locations are not arbitrary. What comes next is the next closest village or the next closest town to where we're walking from. And so there is a sense then of really, first, it's about embedding knowledge in the landscape, but secondly, it's about the actual experience of walking or traveling through that landscape, in which the knowledge is sort of activated as we go through. And that's something that we see as well in the use of sort of memorials, which I'll talk about briefly. These are a couple of examples of pre-modern or classic texts in Javanese and Sundanese that utilize this kind of structure. So when we talk about a linked series of places, one sort of theory that, or formulation that appears is one offered by the anthropologist Jim Fox of the topogeny. So basically a series of place names that are ordered, and he connects it to the importance of genealogy. So that there we begin to see a sort of analogy between constructions of space and constructions of time. The manner in which the importance of a genealogy is the relationship, the kinship connections from the past to the present. Similarly, the importance of place names is that they are connected to important figures in society, important legends about those figures. And we do see this type of structuring principle first observed ethnographically in places like Roti in Eastern Indonesia, but quite easily found in both the ethnographic literature, but also, as I focus more on the literary written literature of peoples throughout Indonesia, the Philippines, and even into the Pacific. Again, there's nothing specifically culturally exclusive about this. I mean, it's not as though such things don't exist in other parts of the world, but there are enough structural similarities between the kinds of ways in which places and these itineraries are constructed, whether it's in oral text or in written texts, that we can justify thinking about it as a sort of Malayo-Polynesian cultural practice that's shared. And it's something which Fox noted and which is very much borne out in my own study, is often the lack of distinguishing between personal and place names. So people are often called by the place they come from, or places are named after the people who come from that place. Generally the former, more often the former, that the people are called. And this is in fact a really strong cultural practice. My father comes from Bali, and he moved to Sydney in the 80s, the early 80s. And his personal name is Ketut, but when he lived in Sydney, he first moved to Kirribilli. And so among the Bali community, it was referred to as Ketut Kirribilli. So there is a sense that the identity of the person is most easily linked to where they live, where they're from. Their identity, in fact, is connected to the place in which they live. And so I think that this is, a sort of a cultural practice that's, certainly prevalent in Bali, but I would be quite confident to say it's generally important throughout this region. In contrast to that point-based understanding of space, linear, I always say linear because it's not a straight line, but sort of a one-dimensional connection of places, is the two-dimensional circle structure, often called a mandala from Indian contexts. Here we have a graphical visual representation of the cardinal points and the intermediate points of the 8 points, north, south, east, west, the intermediates, and then the central 9th point in the center, represented as a sunburst. And you can see, it's a bit vague in the picture, but each of those 8ths of the circle contains a deity, a particular god associated with that direction. All of this, very Indic, very Sanskritic in its deployment. And what's interesting is, okay, this is a schema, this sort of has this religious connotation, but that the real landscape of the political realm of the Majapahit Empire, this 14th century Javanese kingdom, is analogized to that. So that this is extremely center-focused spatial arrangement. Everything is about the power is in the center, and then it radiates outwards towards the periphery, increasing, the further you get from the center, the royal compound, which is the center of the universe, out to the courtyards where the ministers and the commoners live, eventually out to the other countries, further and further out. So this concentric circles. So there is, in the sources, an attempt to bring in real information, real geographical knowledge into the schema. It was popular among historians and anthropologists of Indonesia, of Southeast Asia, I would say in general, particularly in the 80s and 90s, to talk about the galactic polity, about the mandala model, as the one and only way of organizing political space in pre-modern Indonesia, in pre-modern Southeast Asia. And I think that there was merit in putting that approach forward and developing it, certainly to combat sort of Eurocentric ideas. However, I think it was a bit overcooked. Certainly, what we always lost sight of is the fact that it's fundamentally a theoretical idea that was never meant to be an empirical description of landscape in the way that what I showed previously really was. These itineraries are real, they're traceable, one can walk them today, and a lot of really good research is being done at the moment in Indonesia of going back to these old texts and actually physically doing them, testing out how do these routes work, are they accessible? What are these place names, some of which we don't know anymore? Can we relocate them? Can we find them again? And we find over and over that these are highly realistic journeys and itineraries that people, must have experienced for real. Not so much with this sort of stuff. However, some descriptions, particularly in this text, the Dasha Wadana, which I quoted from in the previous slide, do contain enough empirical data to be able to plot them. So here we have a modern mapping, modern reconstruction of a whole group, a huge number of toponyms that are found in this text, in this chronicle, and it is described as a mandala, right? So we have in the center Java, Majapahit, Daha, just mentioned previously, as a sort of the core region of the Javanese-speaking realm in the dark orange, and then the other islands, in the final sentence here, the other islands, the surrounding countries, depicted in the sort of the lighter shade of orange. All of these place names are mentioned in that text as belonging to these 4 sides of the mandala. Some of them, most of them are quite, can be relied upon. We're quite sure. Some of them are a bit speculative. And actually, when we're dealing with a 700-year-old text, not everything, we can't locate every place name precisely. This is particularly important for Indonesians, firstly because of the word Nusantara, which in the original context means the other islands, so it means not Java. Whereas in modern Indonesian, De Nusantara is closer in meaning to archipelago, referring to the whole archipelago, including Java. And as many of you will know, the new capital of Indonesia is now being named after this term, but this is where it comes from in the Indonesian context. And the importance of this map, really, or the geography outlined in this text, is that it makes a sort of claim about geography. So it makes a claim that this vast region outside Java can be understood as a mandala, can be understood in this galactic policy sort of way, but that the information being organized within that mandala is in fact real information about toponyms at a very large scale indeed, as you can see, covering most of Indonesia, modern Indonesia, and a great deal of Peninsular Malaysia, or Malaysia in general. So that scope has been subsequently used in the 20th century as a sort of justification of proto-Indonesian geography, the idea that these areas were united previously by the medieval kingdom, and therefore that justifies the existence of the modern Indonesian state, which also controls a similar territory. So we have then 2 different ways of organizing space. And my final example is one which sort of brings together some of these things. So we've had mostly textual representations of these spatial and temporal organizations, but we also very much have physical ones. So here we have a physical stone that was inscribed in the early 16th century and was described as a memorial. So I want to draw attention to this word memorial, which is written in this text as Shakakala. If you remember, previously I talked about the Shaka era. It's the same word. So the word for Shaka time, that is the era using the Shaka calendar, evolved in Javanese and Sundanese to mean a memorial in general. So there's already a sense in which the notion of the timekeeping of historical writing is merged with the very concept of a historical trace or the commemoration of a particular event. And here we have first the physical artifactual creation of the memorial. This physical object, the stone, is the memorial of the majesty of the former king, and it ties itself to a particular location. The point of these big stones, which are numerous in Java, is not just to convey information on the text, but also to physically mark the location, the physical space of where events occurred. Note here that in addition to, we have two forms of timekeeping being used. The first is the genealogy. So the king that's being referred to is then discussed in terms of his father and his grandfather, who they were and what they did. And then secondly, in terms of the chronogram. So this final chronogram, the 5 Pandawas guard the earth, a similar sort of structure to the one that I showed before with the Dragon King. Each of those 4 terms represents a digit in the Shaka year 1455. So here we've got a historical document, so a historical source talking about specific events, but that event is located in time using 2 devices, the calendar and the chronogram, and the genealogy. But then it is physically located in a particular space defined by this artifact's location. So I just briefly cover what we've been talking about. Historiography in general requires, as its nature as a narrative text, production and construal of these temporal and spatial fields. My way of looking at these fields is through narrative devices. I could imagine there would be other approaches, but that's the one that I take. But the diversity of ways in which these can be constructed offer both opportunities but also challenges for one historiography. How do we deal with it when we have these genealogies, when we have these funny ways of organizing space, when the mandala model, organizes the location this way, but they don't give us, for example, distances, very rarely discussed or talked about. So the scale of space is something which is almost totally elided in Indonesian texts, by contrast to the scale of time, which is often very precisely measured and counted. So why is there that discrepancy? When we try to synthesize these materials, we often run into difficulties, and the tendency has been to try to dismiss and reject the hardest ones and to say, well, the genealogies, they're corrupted, or they're legendary, or they're mythological, or they're not accurate. But I don't think we should approach it that way, because in the challenge, in the difficulty of using with those sources, we might be able to find important information important ways of approaching how we put together information about the past. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Jarrah. We have about 9 minutes for Q&A. Anybody have a question? Yeah, Maris. Yes. I'm sorry.
Right. I would like to know more about the mandala that you're referring to. How big can that be, or how big or how small can that be?
What, sorry?
The mandala?
Oh, yeah. So very extensive. The map I showed of Indonesia, the map of the archipelago, in the Deshawarana text, that is referred to as a mandala. So the extent of the geographical extent, is several thousand kilometers. It refers to the relationship between, at that time, the Javanese kingdom and the other regions in the archipelago. The other regions constituted the perimeter or the periphery of the mandala, and then Java, its center. So we were talking very vast distances.
So is it like a distance, or does it also refer to a sort of a system? I'm asking you this question because in Hindi we call solar system Sor Mandal. So that's like, it's pretty vast, it's infinity, I would say, but there is a system as well,
Yeah. So there are Javanese versions or Javanese translations of certain Sanskrit treatises, which are more astronomical in nature. So which do talk about, say, the size of the Earth as a whole, or the disk of the sun's rotation around the Earth, these kinds of things. So those texts exist, and they do use the word mandala as well for that sort of solar system level thing. I'm still on the fence about whether that represents sort of local Javanese understandings or knowledge, or if it's just part of the Sanskrit tradition that they have been absorbed. Because it's almost just identical to the Sanskrit text. So it's as if they've simply translated a foreign text into Javanese. And say, well, yeah, this is cool. This is some knowledge that we got from Sanskrit sources. So yeah, I mean, one could say that's part of Javanese tradition as well. It's Indonesian tradition too. So that concept exists. But more common, I would say, more mainstream is this notion of mandala as a political realm, and that's something which it's present in the Arthashastra, so it is in the Sanskrit tradition, and that's more widespread, I would say, in the Javanese context, so more generally applicable in the Indonesian context. So it was more frequent for the Indonesians to use the word mandala to refer to those sorts of political territories, but not excluding the fact that sometimes you do see it sort of astronomical or cosmic applications of the term as well.
Thanks, Jarrah. I have a question. Oh, all right.
No, go on.
I'll go first. Yes, so throughout your presentation, I was thinking that a lot of these events, historical events, are focused on royalties, political, figures, which often overlooked the other like community focused aspect of that historical events or era. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about this kind of knowledge production, which do you think is biased? There are some level of bias to it, and how do you overcome this challenge to present more comprehensive history?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The first is that traditionally historians have said, wow, Indonesian chroniclers are so Raja-centric, and they're so focused on the Kraton, they're so obsessed with dynasty. And that was also a critique that a generation of Indonesian historians made of their own traditions. We don't want this sort of traditional monarchical thing. We're going to use other sources. But what we find is actually the sources that exist are much more diverse than that. It's just that the ones that were prioritized early in the scholarship were those Raja-centric ones.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of what constitutes Javanese historical text was, say, in the early 19th century, already defined as, well, it must be the one that talks about the kings.
Yeah.
There were a whole bunch of other texts that talked about ascetics, that talked about hermits, that talked about ordinary people, that talked about this, that, and the other, that were basically not paid attention to at that time, and as a result, are only now sort of really being looked at for the first time, are really being studied, and they're opening up a whole range of different perspectives of what that, a fuller picture of the society, like you said. It's not just about the palace. These sorts of texts, like I showed, the Deshawana and stuff, very palace-centric, right? But it's because those texts are famous because in 1900, that's what the scholars thought were the most important. The other thing is that, going back to my point about us being most familiar with the temporal devices that are closest to ours, those are the texts that the Raja-centric ones. They're the ones that are most likely to use the chronograms, the calendars, the eras. They use the Hijra era. So they're easiest for us to get to as historians, because we say, oh, that's nice. All of these events have dates on them. I can use it for my history. And when a generation of scholars tried to use the genealogies, like the Sejarah Melayu or the Baba Dana Jawi or these sorts of genealogical texts, they struggled because they were Raja-centric, sure, but they didn't have the date information. So when you're trying to use other sources that are not so focused on the palace, but they don't have dates, they don't contain that information, you end up sort of saying, well, this is great, but I can't turn this into a history. I can't connect it to real events, you know, a real timeline that I have. So that's, I think, why I say that this problem of the construction of time is really important, because it leads to us, if we can't engage with these alternative ways of organizing time and space, we won't be able to engage with the texts. And often those texts are the ones that talk about different sorts of community, different sorts of parts of society that otherwise have been neglected. So I think that's why it's sort of important for us to tackle the difficulty of dealing with these different constructions.
Thanks, yeah. Yeah, Bob.
Do you want to start? I'm actually just going to focus a little bit on the spatial stuff, because when you're talking about the itineraries, that actually sort of raise a whole lot of kind of comparative ethnographies. It sounds like Aboriginal songlines would be a fairly obvious one, though I don't pretend to know much about them. But it also sounds like the way the Vikings navigated, and also that medieval fishing, the navigators tended to navigate by routers, as they call them, i.e. sort of itineraries. You know, you head towards something and keep going for 3 days, and if you don't get there, you've missed it. You know, and it's that sort of thing, but without necessarily anything sort of in detail talking about how two places sort of that are not reached through the different itineraries are related. You know, so they're not maps. They're not really they're not easily maps. And I also, you know, have an example when I worked in Rajasthan, and people had no idea how to make a map, but they knew how to navigate beautifully, because they always had a memory of how, if you go to this place, you can go to that place, and so on. And it was only people in the military, and that was a lot of them, who actually could read a map. So I sort of think that is a sort of a real piece of comparative ethnography and so on that would be an intriguing path to follow. And I'm no doubt that the same would apply to the actual, you know, genealogies and the very chronological things too.
You know, I agree. Really intriguing multidisciplinary project.
Yeah, I agree. Because I think what we see with these texts is how, you know, closely connected they are to what would usually be the province of ethnographers, right? The ways in which people use their memories, or people use oral texts which they've heard and memorized or remembered or passed down in order to organize their own understanding of space. I'm often wary of claims that, oh, well, the Javanese, for example, are deeply oral people, because I feel like everyone is. I mean, all societies, you know, use orality as their primary mode of communication. The texts that I look at are, you know, literary. They are written texts, and they do have these literary features, but without doubt, those habits. That's why I was interested in at you know, first going into this sort of notion, and you know, it's a theory of a colleague of mine that's Malayo-Polynesian substrate of thing. I think it's intriguing. I wouldn't say I'm not fully convinced, because, as you say, one, such things are so widespread around the world that it's difficult to say whether, in fact, there is some sort of inheritance there. It might be useful, it might not be, to talk in those terms. But a comparative, I think if we can really get to the nuts and bolts of it, I think. So, okay, we've observed that topogeny exists, right? There are the order lists of place names. They serve some functions, that's good. We can easily identify them. If we can get a more, and I don't think that certainly in my small field this has been done yet, that we could have a really in-depth description. Okay, what exactly makes this one special? What makes it different to that one? Then we might have a really strong basis for comparison. Then we can, okay, well, here are the differences. These are the different purposes to which they're put. And I think that would be really, really fun. And also, I think, really for me, what I find fascinating is why is it that is how the information is organized? It's like this huge, some of these Javanese texts, particularly in the 19th century, it's 1,000 pages long. It's ridiculously, it's like they were just trying to cram as much possible stuff. And whether they were trying to replicate in written form the experience of going out to the countryside, very densely populated countryside in Java, going from village to village and asking this, the older people, what's the story behind this thing, and being talked at for all night, 12 hours, and all of this knowledge being bombarded with it. There's something there that's, I think, quite really interesting as well. It's the idea that the knowledge is out there, huge amounts of it is out there, and all you need to do is sort of go out and to try and make sense of it all. Well, why not use the spatial markers as a way of trying to get on top of it?
Thanks, Jarrah. Any other question? Yeah, oh, okay, we already passed 5. Okay, thank you so much for coming and for your interesting presentation. Yeah, we're going to close up. Thank you everyone for coming, and see you in 2 weeks' time. Yeah, the recording.
That was fascinating.
Yeah.
Really interesting.